everyone. Today I am going to be briefly discussing the Iron Giant movie. This is a animated movie, in particular a kids animated movie that came out in the late 90s. The interesting thing about this one is that I think it is under the Warner Brothers name, so it is not under the Disney company. So I think that is a particular reason why I would put this film in the underrated category, is because it did come out during a time when Disney was really on still a high note and had a large impact in regards to animation. Also with the fact that computers were sort of taking over, and this is largely a 2D based film. So again, I think it's multiple factors that have made it so that this film gets put into that underrated or overlooked category. Now, in regards to what this movie is about, basically this movie is about it has a sort of similar setup to E.T., where you have in particular, a boy character. This particular character's named Hogarth. At least I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, because it's a rather unusual name. And he ultimately befriends a Iron Giant, hence the title. And this Iron Giant is basically a gigantic robot. And you'll kind of see how their relationship develops, and ultimately how that relationship is sort of threatened by the big bad government. Because apparently the government is very paranoid, and this actually takes place during a time when you could argue that there was a lot of paranoia within the air, which is the 1950s. So it does comment on sort of the nuclear age, on sort of the politics that were going on during the time. In particular, they made, even at one point, the kids in the film watch a nuclear sort of test video where, you would be told basically what to do in case there was a nuclear strike. And ultimately this robot sort of falls into being used as a weapon, but you will ultimately see within the plot how it's rather complicated, especially considering that the robot isn't necessarily designed to be on the offensive. So again, you will ultimately see how the robot handles this sort of situation that he ends up coming into. And I would argue that this film touches in on a lot of things that I think kids can identify with or have trouble identifying with. In particular, the film does bring up death, and it does bring up the concept of killing, and how that really impacts the characters. So it does touch in on a lot of things. It's just I don't really want to give a lot of these things away, because again, it's sort of revealed through the plot. But in a nutshell, the plot is basically that it is set up kind of like E.T., but it kind of takes itself into a different direction and focuses in on different things and different concepts. All of the characters are fairly likable for a kid's film. I think that this movie does a really good job with handling the characters. In particular, Hogarth, as well as his friend Dean, and the mother as well, although I don't think she gets a whole lot of development or screen time, really. But it does keep the focus on what the movie should be, and that is the relationship between the Iron Giant and the child. And I think it does a really good job of emphasizing important, not just important aspects that were going on within the time period that it's set in, but also in regards to being more general, in regards to death and weapons and things of that nature, and what it means to sort of be a hero, and so on and so forth. So these kinds of themes, I think, are really identifiable. Now, it could be argued as to whether or not that this movie dives into a lot of cliches. I would say that it kind of has similar setups to other films, um, in particular maybe some children's films. But I think overall it does a good job of executing what is ultimately a good final product. And I think there's a lot to like about this film, especially when it comes to characters, especially when it comes to story, especially when it comes to the aspects that are involved with trying to keep the Iron Giant sort of a secret, because again, they do have a similar setup to E.T., where basically they're trying to sort of hide the monster, and because they're afraid of that if somebody finds out what the monster is, if that a monster exists, that they will ultimately do something either bad to the monster, or they will try to use the monster for destructive means. So again, there are these kinds of things that are sort of thrown in there too. But I think this film does a good job of balancing tone, especially when it comes to comedy as well as drama. Again, there's a lot of funny bits within this film, a lot of funny little touches that it adds in there that I think really works to the film's advantage. And it also has a lot of dramatic moments that don't feel like they were just shoved in there. They do feel like genuine, and they don't really feel artificial. So I think this film has a lot going for it in regards to being a kids' film. And the reason why I put it in the underrated category, why I feel it has been underappreciated, is maybe having to do with the fact that it has a similar setup to other films. Maybe that's the reason why, but I don't think that's a detriment to the film as a whole. It also, I think, has to do with the fact that, again, we were seeing the rise of computer animation throughout the 90s, and we've seen sort of the kind of pushing aside of 2D animation in this era. So I think that's one aspect that I think probably resulted in this film getting into being underrated and underappreciated. I also think it has to do with the fact that, again, it wasn't made by a big studio like Disney during the time, who was really dominant throughout this entire era of the 90s. So I think ultimately that's why it gets put into this underrated category. Again, it isn't DreamWorks either, so I think too, maybe some audience members were suspicious as to whether or not it would be a good product because it doesn't have the DreamWorks or Disney company behind it. So I think ultimately that's why the film got kind of pushed under the bus, which I feel is unfortunate. But I think those are sort of the reasons, from what I could tell, in regards to why this film would not be as highly praised as maybe some other animated films. But I still think it's a really well executed animated film. It is simplistic maybe in certain aspects in regards to its approach, because it does bring up concepts that we've seen before. It does bring up plot lines that we've kind of seen before. But I think how it executes those kinds of things is really what makes the film stand out and make it different from other films that have tried to do this kind of formula and setup. So I think ultimately it's a really enjoyable film. I think there's a lot that the film has to offer for children as well as adults. I think it can be engaging for adults too. And it has a lot more adult characters than kids characters throughout the entire movie. So again, I think that's up to you and whether or not you would consider seeing the film. But I think it's definitely worth a watch or two, and I think it holds some significance, I think, within animation, and the animation is done really well executed animation too. So again, I think it's definitely worth considering. and I think I would put it in this underrated category because of it being coming out during the time that it did, the 90s, and it being sort of 2D, and by the fact that it wasn't a big company that does animation during the time. So yeah, I think those are really the main reasons, but despite those reasons, I think it's still definitely worth considering, and I think there's been a lot of reference to it over the years, and I don't know if it's really gathered a cult following like The Secret of NIMH. Personally, I prefer this film over The Secret of NIMH, even though there are some kind of cliche elements within this film. Only because I thought that the characters were just more relatable and just a little bit more likable, and that there was a lot of different tones that the movie was trying to set up. I like how it was a little bit dark at times, but then there was also a lot of heart and charm. So, I think that's just based upon personal opinion, but I think overall it's definitely worth the recommendation. But if there are any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them, but I think that's really all I can say about the Iron Giant without giving anything away. But I hope you all enjoy your weekend and week, and I hope to see you later on.